When an empath finally breaks, nothing shatters. No slammed door, no screaming match, no dramatic exit scene, just a quiet click somewhere deep inside that nobody else in the room ever hears. And that click is more dangerous to the people who've been taking advantage of them than any explosion could ever be. For most of their lives, an empath operates like an open electrical current. Walk into a room with one, and they pick up on the tension before a single word gets spoken. They feel the argument that happened an hour before they arrived. They sense the sadness someone is hiding behind a joke. Everyone around them gets to plug straight into that current for free, drawing whatever they need, whenever they need it, without ever once asking whether there's anything left to draw from. Think about what it actually costs to run that way, year after year, without anyone noticing the toll. A person with normal wiring walks into a tense room and simply notices the tension exists. An empath walks into that same room and starts absorbing it immediately, adjusting their own tone, their own posture, sometimes their entire mood, before they've even said hello to anyone. Multiply that by every family gathering, every tense meeting, every friend's bad week, stacked on top of each other for years, and you start to understand why exhaustion eventually becomes the empath's baseline state, even on days when nothing particularly difficult has happened at all. To the outside world, this looks like strength. People call them the strong one, the calm one, the one who always knows what to say. But what actually holds that current steady for years isn't strength. It's a quiet, constant self-sacrifice that nobody else can see, because an empath has been trained since childhood to reach for curiosity before anger. When someone treats them badly, their first question is never, "Why would you do that to me?" It's, "What happened to you that made you this way?" That question is generous. It's also a trap, because it hands the entire weight of the relationship straight back onto the empath's own shoulders every single time. Here's the part almost nobody explains clearly. Every time an empath swallows a hurt instead of naming it, every time they excuse a bad pattern instead of confronting it, they're not just being patient. They're taking out a loan against their own future peace, and loans like that always come due, usually with more interest than anyone expected. Let me tell you about a woman named Renee, because her story shows exactly how this plays out in real time. Renee had a younger sister named Kayla, who had leaned on her emotionally and financially for almost her entire adult life. Every crisis Kayla created, Renee absorbed. Every missed payment, every dramatic breakup, every 3 a.m. phone call, Renee picked up, listened, problem solved, and then quietly went to work exhausted the next morning. For years, Renee told herself this was just what good sisters do. She told her friends Kayla had a hard childhood, that she was still figuring things out, that she'd grow into herself eventually if Renee just stayed patient enough. There was a particular winter Renee remembers clearly when Kayla lost a job, ended a relationship, and got into a car accident all within about 6 weeks. Renee drove across town 3 separate times that month, sat in waiting rooms, filled out paperwork Kayla didn't have the energy to deal with, and canceled her own plans more than once without a second thought. She didn't resent any of it at the time. She genuinely believed this was simply what it meant to be a good sister, and some part of her found a strange kind of pride in being the one who could always be counted on, no matter the cost to her own week. Nobody watching from the outside saw the moment it started to erode her, because there wasn't one single moment. It happened the way rust happens, slow enough that you only notice it once the metal is already thin. Here's your rehook, because this is exactly where the pattern turns. The real shift for an empath doesn't happen on some dramatic night with a big blow-up. It happens on an ordinary Tuesday morning, doing something completely unremarkable, when a switch flips somewhere in their head and never flips back. For Renee, it happened while she was making coffee. Kayla had called the night before in tears over another crisis. and Renee had stayed on the phone until nearly 1 in the morning, again. The next day, scrolling through her phone half awake, she saw a post from Kayla, laughing with friends at brunch, looking completely fine, not a trace of the devastation from 12 hours earlier. And Renee just stood there, coffee in hand, and thought a sentence she had never let herself think before. Why am I the only one who's tired? She went to work that day like normal. Nobody around her noticed anything different. And if you'd asked her in the moment, she probably couldn't have explained what had shifted either. But that evening, when Kayla texted asking her to pick up something on the way over that weekend, Renee noticed herself hesitate before responding, something she couldn't remember ever doing before. It wasn't a big pause, just a few extra seconds where, for the first time, she actually asked herself whether she wanted to say yes, instead of just saying it automatically the way she always had. That single question is the most dangerous thing an empath can ever ask themselves, because once it's asked honestly, it can't be unasked. For years, Renee's internal question had always been some version of, "How can I help her?" That question always kept the responsibility on Renee. The new question, "Why am I tolerating this?" does the opposite. It turns the lens around, and once it's pointed inward instead of outward, the entire relationship starts to look completely different. Renee began seeing the imbalance she'd been living inside for years, not as an occasional bad night, but as the actual shape of the relationship itself. And once a pattern like that becomes visible, it's almost impossible to make yourself unsee it again. What happens next isn't rage, even though people often expect rage. It's something quieter and, honestly, far more disruptive to a relationship that's been running on imbalance. It's withdrawal. Not cold, not cruel, just a total redirection of the exact same intensity that used to flow outward, now flowing back inward instead. If Renee could love someone at full volume, it turns out she could also go quiet at full volume. And that shift catches everyone around her completely off guard. The people who benefited from her old pattern will almost always describe this shift the same way. They'll say she got cold. They'll say she changed. What's actually happening is the opposite of coldness. It's honesty, arriving for the first time in years, unfiltered by the constant urge to make everyone else comfortable first. The first visible change is usually the smallest one, and it's also the one that unsettles people the most. Renee stops over-explaining herself. For years, if Kayla accused her of being distant or unsupportive, Renee would spend 20 minutes defending her intentions, clarifying every word, making absolutely sure there was no possible way she could be misunderstood. That habit felt like care. It was actually a kind of performance, done partly out of love and partly out of a hope that if she just found the exact right words, Kayla would finally hear her and change. The first time it actually happened differently, Kayla accused her of always being too busy for a phone call, the same accusation she'd made dozens of times before. In the past, Renee would have launched into a detailed account of her week, her work deadlines, her own exhaustion, anything to prove the accusation wasn't fair. This time she just said, "That's not true, but I hear that you're frustrated," and left it there. No follow-up paragraph. No further defense. Kayla actually went quiet for a moment, clearly waiting for the usual explanation to keep coming, and when it didn't, she didn't quite know what to do with the silence that replaced it. After the shift, that habit simply stops. Renee says what she means once, plainly, and then she lets it sit there instead of chasing understanding through 6 more explanations. This isn't sulking, and it isn't the silent treatment. It's the realization that some people don't misunderstand you by accident. Sometimes not understanding is a strategy, a way of keeping you talking in circles, so the conversation stays about your delivery instead of their behavior. The moment Renee stopped supplying that extra explanation, she stopped handing over the exact tool Kayla had been using to keep the focus off herself. Something interesting happens once that supply of explanation dries up. The masks people have been wearing start to slip, because they were never designed to hold up without someone constantly smoothing the room around them. Renee started noticing things she'd been too busy managing to actually see before. How Kayla only called when she needed something. How compliments only ever showed up right before a favor was about to be asked. How every conversation, once you stripped away the performance, quietly orbited around what Renee could provide next. She started keeping a mental tally without even meaning to. 3 calls in a row that started with a crisis and ended with a request. A birthday Kayla forgot entirely. The same month Renee had reorganized her own schedule twice to help her move apartments. None of these things were new. What was new was that Renee finally let herself actually count them instead of waving each one away individually as an isolated, forgivable incident. This is the point where Renee stopped being a participant in these interactions and became something closer to an observer. A participant reacts to every jab, every guilt trip, every sudden mood shift, staying tangled inside the moment as it happens. An observer sits slightly outside of it, watching the pattern instead of just living inside it. Renee started asking sharper, more useful questions in her own head. Does what this person says line up with what they actually do? How do they react the very first time I say no, before I've had a chance to soften it with an apology? Who are they, really? Once I stop making their life easier for them. Those questions gave her something she'd never had before, which was actual evidence instead of just hope. And the evidence, once she started collecting it honestly, was hard to argue with. The most significant part of this whole shift is Renee's new relationship with tension itself. She used to treat any friction in a room like a fire she personally had to put out immediately, no matter the cost to herself. After the shift, she started letting tension simply exist. If Kayla got upset because a boundary had finally been set, Renee let her be upset. She stopped rushing in with a peace offering to lower the temperature before anyone had time to feel anything real. She realized, slowly, that the discomfort in the room after a boundary belongs to the person who's upset about the boundary, not to the person who set it. People who go through this exact shift often get accused of becoming cold, distant, even a little scary to be around, and that reaction is almost always coming from someone who benefited quietly from the old version of them. What's actually happening underneath that accusation is something closer to a full recalibration of the nervous system than any kind of coldness. For most of an empath's life, their emotional wiring runs exposed, with no insulation at all. Every disappointed sigh from a parent, every heavy silence from a partner, every subtle mood shift in a room lands like a direct hit. Their whole system stays on constant alert, scanning for other people's distress and trying to soothe it before they can even locate their own feelings underneath it. What changes in this later stage is that the empath finally installs something like a circuit breaker between themselves and the world. Not a wall, and not numbness. A breaker. The current can still flow. They can still sit in a room with someone who's upset, still listen closely, still respond with real warmth. But the emotional voltage no longer surges straight through them, uncontrolled. They feel the emotion arrive, they register it clearly, and then they consciously decide how much of it, if any, gets to come inside and stay. This is the difference between being a sponge that absorbs everything indiscriminately and being a mirror that reflects what it sees without soaking it into its own structure. Because of this new breaker, situations that used to trigger a full internal emergency now land completely differently. In the past, if someone gave Renee the silent treatment or dropped a subtle guilt trip, she'd lose sleep replaying it, rushing the next morning to smooth things over before the discomfort became unbearable for her. Now, when Kayla tries that exact same move, it simply doesn't land the way it used to. Renee notices it happening. She names it silently to herself, and then she goes about her day completely unbothered, which is far more unsettling to Kayla than any argument could ever be, because there's nothing left for the old tactic to grab onto. There was a Sunday, a few months into this shift, when Kayla texted a single line, "Guess it's fine that nobody checks on me anymore," clearly hoping it would trigger the old rush of guilt and apology. In the past, Renee would have called within the hour, full of reassurance and explanation. This time she read it, felt the familiar tug of guilt rise for a second, and then simply set the phone down and went back to the book she'd been reading. She texted back later that evening, warm but brief, and didn't mention the guilt trip at all. Kayla never brought it up again, which told Renee more than any conversation could have. This stage forces a genuinely new definition of what closeness even means. For years, Renee believed real intimacy meant complete absorption, that loving someone fully meant losing herself somewhere inside them. She'd equated depth of feeling with depth of suffering, as if the two were the same thing. What she discovers instead, once the breaker is installed, is that real connection actually requires the opposite. You can engage fully with someone without dissolving into them. It's the difference between getting pulled under the water with someone who's drowning and standing on solid ground, reaching a hand down to help without losing your own footing in the process. This new version of Renee becomes remarkably difficult to manipulate, not because she's grown cynical, but because guilt trips and pressure tactics only ever worked on the version of her that was still negotiating with her own feelings. Pressure that used to make her buckle instantly now barely registers, because she's no longer reacting from old trauma on autopilot. She's responding from a place of actual conscious choice, and choice is a far more stable foundation than reflex ever was. In the final stage of this transformation, something even more specific starts to happen. Renee's sensitivity, the same trait that used to feel like an exhausting burden, turns into something closer to a precision instrument. For most of her life, her attention worked like a searchlight running on autopilot, constantly scanning any room for the person who seemed left out, the friend hiding a private hurt, the one quietly simmering with resentment nobody else had noticed yet. Her focus always pointed outward, always asking how she could fix whatever she found. In this later stage, that same searchlight turns inward and becomes analytical instead of rescue-oriented. She isn't scanning rooms looking for a mission anymore. She's scanning for patterns, for truth, for what's actually happening underneath the surface performance everyone else is putting on. At a family dinner around this time, Renee found herself watching an old, familiar scene unfold, her mother subtly steering the conversation to keep the peace, Kayla testing the room to see how much sympathy she could pull that evening, an uncle deflecting a question with a joke the way he always did when something got too close to the truth. In the past, Renee would have been absorbed in all of it, feeling every undercurrent as if it were happening directly to her. This time, she noticed she could see the whole shape of the dinner table at once, almost like watching it from slightly above, without getting pulled into any single current running through it. This is usually where people start describing someone like Renee as having changed, in a way they can't quite name, sometimes even calling it a little unsettling. What they're actually reacting to is the disappearance of automatic compassion, the kind that used to be handed out freely to anyone who asked for it, regardless of whether they'd earned it. Renee can still understand exactly why someone is acting a certain way. She can see their insecurities clearly, trace their behavior back to whatever shaped it. What's different is that understanding no longer automatically triggers comfort or forgiveness. Understanding has become something she allocates deliberately, based on how someone actually behaves over time, not based on how sympathetic their backstory sounds in the moment. This heightened clarity works two different ways depending on how it's used. On one side, it becomes a genuinely powerful form of protection. Because Renee understands human patterns so thoroughly now, she can spot a manipulation tactic forming from a distance, long before it fully arrives. She recognizes love bombing almost instantly. She catches a guilt trip halfway through the first sentence. On the other side, that same clarity carries real influence because truly understanding what drives someone, what they fear, what they crave, what makes them flinch, hands you a quiet kind of leverage in any interaction, whether you ever choose to use it or not. The real skill Renee develops in this stage is learning to live inside the space between a stimulus and her response to it, instead of collapsing that space the way she used to. In the past, an insult landed and she reacted within a second, hurt or defensive, no gap in between. Now, the insult arrives and she pauses. In that pause, she reads the intent behind it. She considers what insecurity might be driving it. She weighs how much this person and this moment actually deserve of her attention. And only then does she choose her response, which is sometimes a sharp, direct truth, and sometimes nothing at all, because silence, used deliberately, can say more than any sentence could. What dies in this final stage is a very specific kind of naivety, the belief Renee had carried for most of her life that everyone secretly had a heart just like hers, and that enough patience and kindness could eventually prove it. That belief gets burned away completely by the time she reaches this point, and what replaces it isn't bitterness, it's clarity. She stops treating keeping the peace as an automatic virtue, because she's finally seen how often keeping the peace simply meant absorbing damage quietly so nobody else had to feel uncomfortable. She understands now that kindness without any boundary around it isn't generosity. It's a slow, ongoing form of self-abandonment, dressed up to look like a virtue. Her kindness doesn't disappear after this shift. It changes shape. It stops being something automatically available to whoever happens to be standing closest to her and becomes something she actually allocates, deliberately, based on how people treat her over time. She learns to say no without attaching a three-paragraph apology to it. This unsettles the people who benefited from the old arrangement the most, and their discomfort is honestly the clearest signal of what's actually changed. They aren't upset because Renee became a worse person. They're upset because the imbalance that used to work in their favor finally closed. Some relationships in Renee's life don't survive this shift, and that's not really a loss in the way it first feels. It's closer to a sorting process, one that finally reveals who was actually there for her and who was only ever there for what she provided. The people who genuinely care step forward and try to meet the new version of her halfway. The people who were only ever along for the free labor tend to drift off on their own, usually with some complaint about how she's changed, without ever quite naming what they actually lost. Kayla's relationship with Renee didn't end after all of this, but it did change shape permanently. There were a few rough months where Kayla tested the new boundaries repeatedly, sometimes with anger, sometimes with a wounded, confused kind of sadness that was harder for Renee to sit with. But slowly, without any single dramatic conversation forcing it, Kayla started calling less often about crises and more often just to talk. She started remembering to ask how Renee's week had actually gone, sometimes even before Renee had to bring it up herself. It wasn't a complete transformation. It was closer to an actual sister showing up in small, inconsistent, but real ways for what might have been the first time in over a decade. None of this means Renee stopped feeling deeply, and that distinction matters more than almost anything else in this story. She still notices what other people miss. She still feels genuine warmth toward the people who've earned it. What's different is that her depth of feeling is now backed by discernment instead of reflex. And that combination turns out to be far more powerful than either one alone would have been. She isn't drifting through her life anymore, reacting automatically to whatever emotional weather other people bring into the room. She's moving through it with intention, watching the patterns with a clarity that used to be completely unavailable to her, back when she was too busy absorbing everyone else's storm to notice the shape of it. If any part of this story felt uncomfortably close to your own life, that recognition isn't an accident, and it isn't a flaw in you either. It's simply the first quiet signal that the same shift might already be starting somewhere inside you too. You don't need a dramatic ending to prove it's real. You just need one ordinary morning, one unremarkable moment where you finally ask yourself the question that changes everything. Not, how can I help them? Just, quietly, why am I still doing this? Once that question is asked honestly, the rest of the shift tends to take care of itself. The people who deserved your light will stay standing in it, and the people who were only ever using it to see in the dark will finally have to find their own way.